Hi there, I'm Thomas and welcome to Prussian Hussar. In today's episode we're going to take a sharp look at this beauty here. Yes, this is the German Cavalry Sword 89 or the Cavalry Degen 89. First of all, we're going to take a quick look into the sources. Afterwards, we're going to dive into the historical background. That means we look a bit into the discussions about the role of the cavalry and therefore the sword, and in comparison a little bit to the lance. But this will be rather short, I think. Afterwards, we're going to look at the sword itself and compare it with a sabre of the modern Olympic fencing. And in the last step, we look how it got attached to the saddle. Now let's have a quick look about the sources. So let's look into the sources, and with the sources as well into the historical background. Because since we are checking out our sources, it's always a good idea to check the historical background too. Now let's start with the first books. This one was published in 1911, as you can see down here. It's the 35th edition, as you can see here. So this one was on the market still at time. These little handbooks were for coming to be cavalrists. That means if you got drafted and you wanted to go to the cavalry, you usually got a book like this as a present, or you bought it yourself. And in these books are mentioned how you have to behave as a cavalrist and what you should do, what you should learn, what there is to learn before, so you got a good read. And in here, then that means we sure may find something about the weapons and how often they have been used. I think in the future we're gonna dig into these books as well quite a bit, because it's just for the everyday life a wonderful source, and as well for the ideal that they had and they wanted to follow up or had to follow up. Now we're looking into the contents, and we can see here that the lance and the sword are mentioned, while the lance has like more around 4 to 5 pages, and the gun had a lot. Here the sword just is mentioned for 1 page, and maybe here a little bit before we as well can see that here the sword is mentioned, the cavalry sword, the cuirassier sword, and the lance afterwards, and then the gun. So let's have a first look then into how you should clean the swords and how you should take them in account. So as we can see here, we have the cavalry sword mentioned. This is the mention for the cuirassier sword, and this here for the lance. So we got a little bit, and this is for all these metal weapons or all these fencing weapons. And here already the gun comes up and is described, which parts are there, how do you have to clean it, and so on. So a few more pages than ever. And here, as we have seen in the contents later on, here is described how you have to use the lance. That means how you should make attacks or whatever with it. So we got here again quite a few pages, and here we got the sword with in total I think maybe a quarter of a page or something like this, so not that much in comparison to the lance, and it's like nothing now here in comparison to the gun, because here is the start of how to use the gun properly, and it goes on and it goes on, still goes on, still goes on, and you can just see how much you have to know about the gun and the lance and how less about the sword. And now here in the second book, which is as well like the handbook that we had before, but now just from another author, published in 1905, so 6 years earlier, but we are apparently right in the same period here. And if you now look here down in the contents, yes, a bit more in the center, here the fencing with the lance is mentioned, and this with the sword, and then the fighting with the gun. And we see again, like in the previous one, that, well, for the sword there might be not too many pages. So let's have a look here. And again, here the fencing with the lance is mentioned. Quite a few pages still. And we are still here with the lance. And here are finally with the sword. And we see it's at least 1.5. And this book already says it's just an help. You use it only if you lose your lance or if it gets broken, here in the first paragraph. And so the training with the sword is just the basics and not more. Apparently here we get here with the sword apparently the description that you just use it when your lance gets broken or you lose it. And here in the second paragraph it's just said that it's just trained a little bit, so you got the basics, but not like everything. In comparison, again, just with the mass of text that you had with the lance, here the sword just has at least 1.5 pages, but in comparison to the lance now, not that much actually. I think that's no fine for the sword to have the comparison out of these two books. And with these two books we already see that in the pre-war period the sword hadn't the importance like the lance or even the gun. So as we have seen, the two previous books, they were made for the troopers, but of course for the going to be officers there were these books too, but of course they had a little bit more material because they were more bound into the organization and whatever, and they had a little bit more on regulations how to behave even in the everyday life. This one has been written by the author who has written the second book that we looked in. This one was published in 1911, so we are still very close to the previous two ones, of one which was as well published in 1911. And if you look here in the contents, you just can see here the lance is mentioned, here how to fight with a gun, and that's it. The sword is not even mentioned in here. We can see that the sword apparently did not have the importance on the fightings as the other two weapons had. So another structural source is this one. So this was more critic to the regulations that were to the training and how things might have done better. It was published in 1910, so still we are pretty close to the previous books apparently, which of course is what we want. And just by the contents here we can see that a lot of different pieces were discussed in this book or in this part of discussion. And if we now come here to the training with the swords and the lance, we again can see here that the lance gets a few more pages than the sword. And of course, again here the training with the gun has far more pages again. And here we are. So here again we have pages for the lance, and here we have here again just apparently 4 lines. Just 4 lines for the training with the sword. And it says, you should do it a little bit, but not too much. You shouldn't forget it, because every once in a while in the close combat a soldier would need the sword. But as you can see, it's just 4 lines in contrary to at least 1.5 pages for the lance and several again with the gun. Now for the pre-war discussions. Well, actually there was a discussion in the pre-war period about the cavalry and their role, if they should still stick to their old and traditional role of attacks with swords and lances against a line of infantry, or if they should become more like dragoons or mounted infantry. And this article that we can see here now, I just got it in a digital version. It's a part of the discussion between the traditionalists and the reformists. And this article raises the question, is it better for the cavalry to have the sword or to have the bayonet? And since It's a traditionalist. He comes to the conclusion that it would be better for the cavalry to have the swords, even if they don't train too much with it, rather than the bayonet, because they would need it all the time. And the question for the traditionalists and reformists, which was going on in the pre-war period, so the mentioned discussion between the reformists and traditionalists is as well described here in these two books. So this discussion was done in the Reichstag, in the public, and even in magazines to see how and where the army should evolve in the pre-war period. And of course, for the traditionalists, it was important for the cavalry to have their old role of being on the horse, so it in some parts pretty romantic, while the reformists were more for the gun-centered mounted infantry, actually, because riding attacks against the machine guns, against the artillery, might have not been the best idea. And so the reformists were for the cavalry that they should take more the bayonets and not the swords themselves. So of course this was always a discussion between the traditionalists and the reformists. And this discussion was basically done until war broke out. Let's move on to the next book. And here in the next book, the author describes in here how the sword was used by the troops and how it wasn't used. And basically he says, as war broke out, the troops went to the war with the swords. In fact, they had to sharpen it. So of course in peacetime, the weapons were still blunt, and they had to get sharpened when war broke out. This is described, for example, here in this diary of a hussar. I'm putting the link, I think, down here, where he describes that his sword gets sharpened. This discussion, if they should stick to the bayonets or still hold on to the swords, was actually done even in between the war. Because, well, the problem was the cavalry still had their lances, but if you lose a lance, if it's got broken or whatever, you still need a good sidearm, which was the sword. But then, of course, all of the fighting, or a lot of the fighting, happened on foot. That means you had to get off your horse with your gun, and therefore you just need more the bayonet. So now, as we look here in this picture, this sympathetic little chap has his bayonet there, and so it's pretty hard to grasp, actually, because sometimes the troop had to give in the swords. After a while, they got some back because of the problems of the lances. At some time, they didn't got it back, and it's pretty hard. So you have to look pretty close and pretty precisely at what period which regiment had the swords or not. Of course, this counts just for the mounted troops, because after a while, some troops got dismounted, and therefore they didn't need the sword anymore. And now let's move on to the more personal source. Now, after this rough overview over the discussion, or discussions actually, we go down to the more personal level. And now here in this book, where the 8th Hussars are the main subject, which was published in 2000, I think. Here we have a small article about a very specific hussar of this regiment. And only thing that's important is in here that it says that this trooper bought his own sword, paid for it 18 mark, as we can read here. Every hussar wanted to have such a sword just for the representational things. So it happened often that there were some private purchased swords just for the dresses there. So the so-called dress swords who won't be taken into the war, but just let at home for the beauty, and most of these swords are still available today. Now, of course, the sidearm here was nonetheless a very big thing to have, or a thing to be proud of, because the sword was so important for the representation. There were swords for fighting and as well for the dresses, so the dress swords, so to speak. That means usually you got a simple sword for the fighting and a very beautiful, a bit more expensive dress sword for your representation. Most of the swords you see today are the surviving examples of the dress sword. In this article, it is even described that everyone was looking for a good new sword, and that there was big buying and selling in between the troopers themselves just to get a new or a better or very good sword. Mostly as well for a good price. Now, more on the personal level, we can look at Freiherr von Knigge. This guy here, he volunteered with 16 to the 10th Hussars in 1916. That means right in the middle of the war. We just can look into his letters and see what he did write about the sword itself. In his letters home that were published in 2014, he describes different occasions. Let's just have a short look. So the sword is mentioned like 3 times. The first time he mentions the sword on the 1st of July in 1916, and he says that the lance is a very wonderful weapon, that he likes the lance more than the boring sword, and he hopes that the lance won't get cancelled after the war. And then in another letter, the next mentioning of the saber is here in maybe mid of August 1916. We haven't here the specific date, but it was between the 11th and the 16th, so we know. Here we got the mention because here he says that they aren't allowed anymore to have the bayonet, but they have to wear the sword actually, and he thinks it's crazy, which is pretty interesting because we are here now in the very in the middle of the war, in the middle of 1916, and here we already can see the change between the different weapons and how frequently even the bayonets and the swords were changing at the cavalry. We as well see here how it changed all the time with the sword and bayonet to wear. And the third mention of the sword is in here. It's on the 24th of August. He describes in his time as a recruit, he had to train fencing with a saber, or with a sword. Sorry for saying saber all the time. He says that it's pretty different from the academical fencing, because the academical fencing comes more from the wrist, while the military fencing comes more from the whole arm. That means the academical fencing, to be quick, you just need to move your wrist, while the military fencing is you get all this time. How the fencing worked? Well, I have a regulation for this, but we don't look at this today, just another time, because we want to do it on a horse, right? And as mentioned video before, we have just to do some more stuff, like here a side project I'm working on. So sorry for the mess on this table. To this project we come another time, because it's pretty much to do. And yeah, as we can see here in the later not mentioning of the sword, that apparently during the war, or while he was at the front lines, he did not use his sword, which as well is pretty good to know. And now let's move on to the next sources. So the next source we are using are here the military passes. Yeah, I have got like 5 of these for the cavalry. Yeah, we look into them. Of course, this is not representative, but if you got yourself some and you can see what is written in them, please let me know, so we can collect some data, right? And in these military passes, usually it is mentioned with what the soldiers were trained during their time as recruits, so the later persons would know. And if we go in here now, we can see where he served at the Hussars number 5, and 2 pages later we can see with what he was trained. So we can read in here, he was trained with a carabine, with a sword, and of course with a lance. So we got the sword mentioned 1 time, and onto the next. This one was trained at the 16th Hussars, and he was trained with the carabine and the lance, and the sword is not mentioned in here, so we got a no for the sword. Oh, it was not specifically mentioned, because we know he was trained with it, but it didn't take that much room into account, right? He was at the Uhlans number 13. He was with the carabine and the lance. Again, the sword is not mentioned at all, so a second one without even mentioning it. And the next one, so he was trained at the Uhlans number 14. And with what was he trained? With the Carabine 98, with a sword, and with a lance. So we got a 2-2. And the last one, where was he trained? At the Hussar number 16, actually. And with what was he trained? He was with a carabine and with a lance. And then he was as well trained with the pioneers, but the sword is not mentioned. So in 2 out of 5 the sword was mentioned. That would be now very interesting if you guys would let me know if the sword is mentioned in the military passes you own or not, for collecting some more data. Because the sword was considered usually a sidearm, it doesn't even get mentioned that much in the military passes. Usually lance and carabine are written down as a trained weapon, but the sword not always. And now let's move on to the next theme. Now let's have a look at the sword. So first of all, just to see from when it was, you usually have to look at the scabbard, because on the scabbard you can read a bit when it was produced or given out. From 1908 on, the scabbard was painted in black. So here you can see it once it was black, but apparently someone decided to unblacken it someone. The ring is for fastening the sword on the belt or on the saddle. How it works, come later to this one. And I think that is for the scabbard now so far. And now let's look at the sword itself. First of all, we start with the blade. And as you can see, it needs pretty urgent a little bit of cleaning, because it's a little bit rusty. Okay, it's black rust, but it, in my opinion, it doesn't belong to it. So I'm gonna clean it, and latest when I'm on a horse, it will be cleaned and pretty good to look at, I think. Now let's look here at the blade. As we can see, it's pretty broad, and that means it's pretty stable for cutting, but as well for thrusting, because as we look now here on the pointy end, it's pretty good for thrusting. And when we look a little bit into old manuals about fencing, well, at least in Germany, thrust fencing was considered to be more noble than cut fencing, which is interestingly the same thing until the modern days or until today. Because if you look a little bit into the structures and people who are fencing in the Olympic fencing with EPs in sabre, we sure can see that the EP people are a lot more than the sabre people. Just an interesting note to have. And then we can see here the pair of metal a little bit, just to stabilize the blade. And we can see as well, yeah, it's pretty stiff, as you can see, not much bending, so it's almost perfect for thrusting. And it's, I think, in contrary to the British Cavalry Sword of 1907, the blade is a bit broader actually. That's it for the blade so far. Now let's go here up to the hilt, and this one here is one of the most interesting parts of the blades. That means here you can see the Prussian eagle, so it means it's from the state of Russia, but of course all the other German states had their own coat of arms in here. So now if you look in crows and the different sketches, we can see the Bavarians had their lion, the Hessians had their, I think, their Hessian lion, then Saxony had their coat of arms, and all the other states, yeah, just look at them. Then the hilt could be fastened or just for clapping, so this one isn't fastening, but you can move it, as you can see, and here even. Apart from this, the hilt could be in silver or in brass. This one is painted pretty poorly actually in brass. Beneath it, it's pretty much silver. Maybe someone who had it before painted it in a pretty bad quality actually, because I started to clean it, and as you can see up here, beneath the paint it's starting to get silver, and then as we turn it here from the side, you can see this part from the hilt is basically showing how you should have your hands. So it's a little bit preventing from having the hammer grip, which is so, or which would be pretty uncomfortable, but it's better to put your thumb up here so you can move it pretty good. British Cavalry Sword of 1907 had even a spare up here for a thumb. And then again, if we look in here, we can see we have here a spare at least for the finger, while the last three are all down here. Then the grip is made of some very hard rubber, and it's pretty comfortable actually in your hand. I like it very much, to be honest. Now I think we should measure it. So let's see how long the blade is. So now here from the pointy end up to the blade, it's 78 centimeters, and in total we have like 92 centimeters or something, and up here on the broadest part we have 2.5 centimeters. And now, in comparison to the Olympic saber, we sure can see a few differences, but as well a few similarities. So the similarities are clear to see. Here the hilt we got here on the back, but here it's a bit more bigger than here. Then the grip. Well, here it forms your grip while the Olympic one does it as well. Only difference is you don't have here a tight grip for your finger, but more for your thumb to lay in. So this is pretty close to the British Cavalry Sword of 1907. And yeah, the blade is a bit longer, which is pretty interesting, because with this one you just fence on the foot, while you had to use this on your horse. Then it is apparently thinner, which is not that much surprisingly, because nowadays you have to get all the actions out of your wrist and not of your arm, as Knigge mentioned it in his letters. That means you have to be fast with it, and you don't need that much of an impact or whatever, you just need to touch. While with this one you would have to need all your strength just to go through the enemy. Let's put it on the side again. And now let's move on how to fasten it, and to fasten it even on the saddle. And well, before we fasten the sword on the saddle, I actually forgot one thing earlier at the sword itself. That's here up on the hilt. As we can see, this little hole actually, it's the very important hole, because here it's for the sword nub, so you won't lose your sword while in combat. So always the best just to forget the most important parts, right? Anyway, now let's move on here to how to fasten the sword on the saddle. We need three things for it: the sword and its scabbard, then apparently the saddle, which you have seen earlier before, and the saber carrier, which is called in German Säbeltragevorrichtung. That's a beautiful word, right? Again, the saber or the sword carrier is Säbeltragevorrichtung. Now, how is it fixed? So as we can see, we have here three bigger holes, or three leashes to say, and then where to place the sword. So we put it up here and down here, just pulling it through. Then, as mentioned with the scabbard, we just have here the ring and the strap, and the strap comes here through the ring, pulling it through, and then fastened. Now it's good fastened here on this piece, and we have here another strap, which is for fastening it here on the saddle. As you can see, it's on the left side, where it was actually in the war. So some saddles have the ring more in the back, some have it more here on the front, so it depends. And as well you can read with it how important the sword was, or even if on the saddle was the sword or not, sometimes. And then it's run through the then the strap is closed here, and of course you can look at the length, so you have it easier when you're on the horse to get it. And yes, it's a bit whoops, that was wrong. It's a bit complicated just to do it like this. So now it's fastened here, and you see here an extra strap which is just used to be able to fasten it proper, and you have just the ability to do it in both directions, in the back or more to the front, where just it is needed or where you just can put it, right? And that's it, that's the magic. And then the sword is now fastened on the saddle. Let's see for a last conclusion. Now, what is there to say about the conclusion? Well, as we have seen on the blade, it is made for cutting and thrusting. Well, thrusting, of course, was the #1 idea. Pretty easy to get it on your saddle. And the question about bayonet or sword and the discussion that was led pre-war and apparently even during the war is pretty hard to grasp, actually. Because as we have seen even in the letters, that it could change all the time. And sometimes it was important as a backup weapon to the lance, and sometimes it was too much, sometimes it was just right, as long as you were on the horse. As soon as you were dismounted, the sword was not longer needed. But here and there, sometimes it had the role as a backup weapon, so not all the regiments had to give in all their swords. For every regiment, we would have to look very deep and pretty close. Were they mounted? When were they mounted? What was about the lances? And did they have the swords as backup weapons or not? So now for us, it's pretty easy and pretty good to use. As mentioned, the fencing manuals, well, we're gonna check them out another time. And now, as we have seen how this blade is, how the sword is, well, as soon as we are on the horse and we are testing the fencing manual, we at least know it a little bit. And let's see how it is moving and how we can use it on the horseback, right? But again, until we are on the horse, we still need a little bit of equipment, and I'm actually right now working on another piece. Well, it needs its time, but when it's finished, yeah, we have another video about it. But the next one would be, well, we shall see. And until then, have a good one. Don't forget, always remember,